So at times you wind up with riots against customs agents. For example, John Hancock, who was a huge smuggler, perhaps the biggest. An English customs officer was trying to search his ship, the Liberty, and was tarred and feathered. And as a result, 4,000 British troops were sent to Boston. So what you get now is, for the first time, many colonists began calling people who joined the non-importation movement patriots. Alright, so we fast forward a few years all the way to March 5th, 1770. Alright, so by now Boston has become the center of resistance. Royal British troops had been stationed there since a 1768 riot against British attempts to enforce trade regulations, and the unpopular and low-paid British troops had been competing for jobs on the waterfront with the city's laborers. Alright, so after the tarring and feathering at the Liberty, there were a bunch of redcoats in Boston, and since these soldiers were so poorly paid, they often had to get a second job, and that meant they were in competition with an already unwelcome redcoat was in competition with your local, say, rope maker, who happened to be the guys who got into their fight at the Boston Massacre. They were competing with them for jobs. Alright, so on March 5th, 1770, a fight between Bostonians and British soldiers escalated into an armed confrontation that left 5 Bostonians dead. The commander and 8 soldiers were put on trial, and they were defended by John Adams. So John Adams was a lawyer for the Redcoats, who opposed both British policies and lower-class crowd actions against them. So he was a member of the elite. Though only 2 of the British soldiers were convicted of manslaughter, and the rest were found not guilty, Paul Revere and other colonists helped stir up indignation against the British through inaccurate but widely circulated propaganda depicting the incidents as a massacre of unarmed Bostonians, which you see pictured here. What happened was, as they were walking home, they had a little too much to drink. They had clubs in their hands, the Americans did, because they were rope makers who had to bang the rope to soften it up, to braid it. So they were coming home. It was nighttime. They began throwing snowballs at the redcoats. One thing led to another, and the rest is literally history. Alright. Non-importation temporarily cut British imports by 1/3, and although the boycott on the Townshend duties faltered by 1770, British merchants' fear of future trade disruptions led to the repeal of all of the Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea, which comes to play in a little bit. The British also agreed to remove troops from Boston, and American merchants abandoned the boycott. So now we get to the Tea Act of 1773. So I'm reading from the notes beneath the slide here. The next colonial crisis demonstrated how events throughout the British Empire reverberated in America. The East India Tea Company was a giant trading monopoly that effectively ruled recently acquired British possessions in India. With the company nearing bankruptcy and being what we would call today too big to fail, the British government decided to help rescue the company by marketing its surplus of tea in North America. The British government, headed by Lord North, gave the company advantages that allowed it to dump low-priced tea on the American market, which undercut colonial merchants and smugglers, and it wanted to use taxes on imported tea to help pay for the cost of colonial government, another move that threatened the colonial assembly's control over finance. Although the tea tax was not new, and in fact it actually lowered the tax, so the English had to lower the tax, thinking the colonists would now pay it, many colonists argued that a tax on a large new body of tea imports would acknowledge Britain's right to tax the colonies. So that the colonists refused to pay it out of principle, because they felt by paying it, it would be a tacit acknowledgement, yes, they can tax us. Alright, so now we get to the Boston Tea Party, 1773. Mounting opposition culminated in what much later became known as the Boston Tea Party, in which some colonists disguised as Indians dumped tea from British ships into Boston Harbor, causing an enormous loss to the East India Company. In response, England in 1774 passes the Coercive Acts, or as they're called over here, the Intolerable Acts. We have the Port Bill Government Act, the New Quartering Act, and the Administration of Justice Act. And I'm reading from underneath here. North's government and the Parliament responded with a series of punitive laws the colonies came to call the Intolerable Acts. They closed the port of Boston until all the East India Company had been compensated. That's the Port Bill. They altered the Massachusetts Charter of 1691 by curtailing town meetings and authorizing the governor to appoint council members previously elected, thereby ending democracy in the entire colony of Massachusetts. And that is the Government Act. That was the big one. And it allowed British military commanders to house troops in colonists' private homes. All right, so commonly people think that the Port Bill, the closing of the Boston Harbor, was the one that galvanized the other colonies with Massachusetts, with Boston. But it was really the Government Act. I mean, think about it. Basically, England shut off democracy in the whole colony when it was just Boston that did this. So that's what scared the rest of Massachusetts and the rest of the colonies, and went a long way towards galvanizing them together in rebellion against England. So now we also, I mean, this is kind of like a fifth intolerable act, the Quebec Act. Simultaneously with the intolerable acts, and I'm reading from beneath here, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which extended Canada's boundaries and allowed for legal toleration of the Roman Catholic Church in the new British province, the land they got from France as a result of the war. It was meant to secure the allegiance of Britain's new subjects. The Quebec Act also caused many colonists, especially New England Protestants, to fear that the British now threatened both their political and religious freedoms. The problem was, in the eyes of Protestant colonists, the law granted religious toleration to Catholics in Canada. And that brings us to the First Continental Congress, 1774. 55 delegates from 12 colonies, and the agenda was how they would respond to the Coercive Acts and the Quebec Act. Alright, and each colony had one vote, and that's actually what it looked like. And I'm reading from beneath here. By 1774, British actions had eroded the imperial government's legitimacy among many colonists, and opposition to the intolerable acts spread to small towns and rural areas that had not yet participated in the resistance. Like I said, it helped galvanize. We must remember that the acts now covered the entire colony of Massachusetts, and the other colonies felt threatened. To coordinate resistance to the acts, that month a Continental Congress met in Philly. Composed of political leaders from all the colonies except Georgia, it included men like John Adams and his more radical cousin Sam Adams of Massachusetts, and from Virginia, George Washington. The Congress adjourned in October 1774 after it agreed to meet the following May if its demands to England were not met. It formed the Continental Association to halt virtually all trade with Great Britain and the West Indies. This was the beginning of a process that transferred effective political power from colonial governments whose authority derived from Great Britain to extra-legal bodies reflecting the popular will. So this was becoming, the Continental Congress was becoming the de facto government of the colonies. In other words, the colonial governments up until that point had gotten their authority via their attachment to England. Now, these guys were taking it from them, de facto, in fact, not in law yet. By early 1775, thousands of men, many of whom were without property and who had never before been part of the political nation, were serving on these committees, which became laboratories for self-government and soon revolution. So they wrote to England asking for redress of their grievances, and were hoping they were met. And they agreed to meet at a later date in case they were not met, and they weren't. Alright, so in the meantime, we have the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord, April 18th, 1775. Alright, who fired the first shot? We'll never know. To many historians, this is the beginning of the Revolutionary War. To some, 1774 is the actual beginning, when Boston, without raising a finger in violence, actually Massachusetts, farmers in Massachusetts, thousands of them, caused English officials to resign from their positions and kind of take over the colony. But this is the first kind of violence between the English and the colonies in an organized effort. Alright, so that brings us to the Second Continental Congress, 1775. I'm reading from beneath here. Despite the war's outbreak, Many colonists were reluctant to embrace independence from Great Britain, such as John Dickinson. They were not ready to break free, some of them. Many were still proud of British political institutions and culture and the power and glory of the British Empire. And more than a few political leaders worried the rebellion might cause internal social conflict between the elite and the middling folk, particularly between elites and the disenfranchised, meaning didn't have much political power, and less wealthy Americans. So the elite rebels were worried about what would happen if they were free from England. Would there be a class conflict? Leaders in Massachusetts and Virginia, incensed by the intolerable acts and confident of their ability to retain authority in those colonies, supported independence, as did many Southern leaders, who guarded their political liberties and were enraged by a British proclamation in Virginia in late 1775 offering freedom to escaped slaves who enlisted in the Royal Army, in the British Army. And this was known as Lord Dunmore's Proclamation. Remember this. In New York and Pennsylvania, opposition to British policies had animated small farmers and urban artisans whose calls for a greater voice in political life prompted many leaders to hesitate to call for independence. That is, in other words, the elite were wary of the common man getting into positions of authority, questioning the society of deference, kind of knowing your role. In other words, the elite were a little fearful that when the common man got wind of this whole democracy thing, they were going to say, hey, I want to keep it. I want to keep having a voice in my own government. And they would no longer be what's called deferential, deferring to the elite to govern. Alright, so let's hang in there. We have one or two more slides and we're done. Alright, so now we get to Thomas Paine's Common Sense. I'll go quick on this because there's a video quiz that's solely on this. So ironically, not a colonist but a recent emigrant to Philly from England, Thomas Paine offered the arguments that catalyzed the final move toward independence. Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, published in January 1776, criticized the British Constitution for its principles of hereditary rule, or absolute monarchy that you can get through being born to the king, and monarchical government, and he argued that the residue of tyranny survived in the form of the monarchy and the aristocratic House of Lords over in England. Excuse me. Paine argued that only a democratic system based on frequent elections with a single written constitution could ensure liberty. Paine argued that the colony's membership in the British Empire was more burdensome than beneficial. Paine ended the pamphlet by assuring his readers that American independence was linked with the freedom of people everywhere, and argued that the new nation would become a haven for freedom and, quote, an asylum for mankind. People can come here, they will come here. Although most of Paine's ideas were not original, he addressed them to all Americans and made it accessible by expressing them in a clear, direct, and plain language, unusual in most political writing at that time. Common Sense quickly became one of the most successful and influential pamphlets in the history of political writing. The intensification of the war, combined with Paine's stirring appeal for independence, sparked more calls for independence in many American communities. So that brings us to what the Second Continental Congress approved, the Declaration of Independence, 1776, which was primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson. A second set of eyes were Ben Franklin and John Adams, and then the Second Congress got their hands on it as well. It was on July 2nd, 1776, Congress formally declared the U.S. an independent nation, and 2 days later adopted the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson, and it was revised by the Congress before its approval. Alright, so be sure to take the quiz that will pop up right now.